Good evening, this is Viewpoint. I'm Zaka Jacob. Prime Minister Modi has made some historic commitments at the COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow, Scotland. India has pledged to have net zero emissions by 2070, the last of the large developing countries to make a firm commitment. More importantly, cutting over 1 billion emissions by 2030, taking renewable power to more than 500 gigawatts by the end of the decade. These are the most ambitious goals ever set by a developing country. The question now is, will the developed world return the favor by being equally ambitious and equally generous with climate financing and technology transfer?
Fossil fuel, India's main energy driver. India, the third largest emitter, but with a per capita energy consumption much lower than the developed world. Yet, a country still in its development phase has made a big promise to save the planet. Net zero emission by 2070.
वर्ष 2070 तक भारत नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य हासिल करेगा। दूसरा, भारत 2030 तक अपनी 50% एनर्जी रिक्वायरमेंट्स रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी से पूरी करेगा।
With this, the Prime Minister warded off intense pressure to commit to an unrealistic target of 2050. Prime Minister Modi explained India's stand and put out the 5 commitments the country was making at the Glasgow Climate Summit COP26. Net zero emissions target to be achieved by 2070. Increase non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030. 50% energy requirement to be met by renewable energy by 2030. Reduce carbon emission by 1 billion ton by 2030. And the country's emission intensity to be reduced by at least 45% by 2030. While India made bold commitments, it also called out the rich countries for failing to do their bit in mitigating the climate crisis.
Friends, ये सच्चाई हम सभी जानते हैं कि क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस को लेकर आज तक किए गए वायदे खोखले ही साबित हुए हैं। भारत की अपेक्षा है कि विकसित देश जल्द से जल्द $1 ट्रिलियन का क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस उपलब्ध कराएं।
Wealthy nations had promised $100 billion a year to developing nations by 2020 in the Copenhagen 2009 summit. But they did not live up to the commitment. Climate finance is money paid by rich countries which have been responsible in the past for emissions to developing countries. This to help them meet emission reduction targets. Narendra Modi, after all, has always been a fierce climate warrior. Back in 2013, Gujarat was the first to set up a separate department for climate change, accounted for nearly 30% of carbon credits earned by India. Under him as Prime Minister, India is the only country in G20 which is on the fast track to achieve climate goals. And now, Modi's commitment at COP26, one that has arguably eclipsed tall claims by world leaders like President Biden, has set a new benchmark that should push richer nations to do their bit. Bureau Report, CNN News 18.
All right, I want to first go across to Sanjay Suri, who's joining us live from Glasgow, right outside the venue, where right now deliberations are on to try and see if they can chalk out a joint statement, some kind of a Glasgow declaration, if you will. But Sanjay, I want to talk about the statement made by the Prime Minister yesterday and how it was received. India is finally committed to a firm deadline for net zero emissions 2070. It's the most ambitious target set by a big developing country. I think India was the only one left after China committed to it a couple of years ago. How is it being received by other members, other delegations? Are we now seeing a slightly more firmer path, if you will, for cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions? Sanjay, I think you're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself, please. All right, we'll try and see if we can fix Sanjay's audio in just a second. But this is, like I said, one of the most ambitious climate goals set by any country in the world. India committing to a 2070 deadline for net emissions. And more importantly, over the next decade or so, India has pledged to cut down emissions by 1 billion. That's almost a third of all the emissions from India on a per year basis. And then you have the very, very ambitious goals of making 50% of India's energy consumption from renewables, again by the end of the decade, and taking India's the share of renewable energy upwards of 500 gigawatts by the end of this decade. So clearly some very, very ambitious goals being set. Two questions stand out. One, will this in any way, forestall the growth story of a country like India, which needs to grow, some would say even in double digits for the foreseeable future, to try and lift millions out of poverty? And the second most important aspect, of course, is what will this do to the developed world? Will they keep now their share of the bargain in both in terms of climate financing as well as technology transfer? Let me go across to our guests now. We're getting in Arunabha Ghosh is the CEO of the Council for Energy, Environment and Water. Pulash Mukherjee is the lead climate resilience and air quality at NRDC India program. Neha Pahuja is fellow for Earth Science and Climate Change at TERI, and Alka Kelkar is Director, Climate World Resources Institute of India. I want to start with you, Arunabha Ghosh. Yesterday, the Prime Minister committing to net zero emissions by 2070, also cutting down almost 1 billion emissions by the end of the decade. How ambitious are these targets, and how big a deal is this, according to you, given India's own track record, particularly in the last 10 years or so?
Zaka, this is a very big deal. This is, I believe, the boldest announcement India has made on climate action in any of the climate negotiations over the last 2.5 decades. I think it's very important to recognize how transformative these announcements are. We are looking at a net zero emissions by 2070. But what does that mean? It means we are going to bring emissions down to that level much faster than the developed world has managed. Even though richer countries have put forward net zero emissions targets for 2050, they are actually taking more than 7 decades to get there because they peaked emissions in the 1970s. So what India is promising to do is actually far more aggressive in terms of climate action. But it has also backed up that long-term commitment with in terms of the non-fossil generation capacity, the emissions reductions, the reductions in emissions intensity of GDP, and so forth. So there is a long-term target, but it's backed up by near-term targets that we can measure our performance against.
Let me go to Pulash Mukherjee, and I think that's a good point that Mr. Ghosh made. There is a long-term target. Obviously, none of us are going to be around in 2070, but certainly the ambitious targets for 2030, whether it is taking renewables upwards of 50% of India's total energy consumption, whether it's 500 gigawatts of renewables, whether it's cutting emissions by 1 billion by the end of the decade, all of these, how realistically achievable are these?
Thanks, Zaka. I think Arunabha put it very aptly. These are extremely significant developments, and I'm more excited by the short-term commitments per se. Like you said, a lot of them are enhancements of India's existing NDCs, and significant enhancements, I must say. And India is well on the way to achieving some of these. Like, for instance, our RE capacity is significant and is growing at a very rapid rate over the last couple of years, and is expected to do that in the coming years. The reduction in emission intensity is also, we are on track there, and the reduction, the target of 1 billion ton reduction in CO2 emissions is extremely exciting. It is achievable, but it requires a lot of significant inward-looking policy, and that's something that must be discussed intently in the next couple of months, next coming year, in my opinion. The same holds true also for the long-term targets. The pathway to achieving net zero is what will define, is what is important, and that will also need a lot of institutions, not just at the federal or national level, but also at the subnational, and a significant improvement of capacities within the city levels as well.
Okay, I want to go across to Neha Pahuja as well. Just in terms of, if you're, let's take one point, the cutting of emissions by 1 billion by the end of the decade. That would also imply a significant move away from fossil fuels, because cars are, of course, a big reason, or transport is a big reason for India's greenhouse gas emissions. A significant move away from fossil fuels to electric vehicles. Do we have the capacities, do we have the infrastructure in place to make that kind of a big switch over the next 10 years?
No, actually, the points that you mentioned, it's all order. We have put forward ambitious pledges, so there is no denying fact about that. However, if you call about the capacity, like electric mobility, do we have the infrastructure? No. At the moment, we don't. But do we want to have it? Yes. India has already it's all about implementing, and that's the reason I think in the closing speech of his speech also PM highlighted the need for financial assistance of the order of $1 trillion USD. I think that would be critical, and now the ball is in the court of developed world also to live up to their pledges and to give that technology and financial support to India and other developing countries who have come forward and taken highly ambitious targets.
Alka Kelkar, I think that's a great point. In 2009, I think it was in Copenhagen, the developed world had pledged to transfer something like $100 billion through climate financing. I don't think all of that money has gone to the developing world. Now the Prime Minister yesterday in his speech sort of nudging and urging the developed world to up that figure to $1 trillion in climate financing. But given the West's track record, do you expect that to happen? Because then it seems like, the developed world, which took 200, 300, 400 years of industrial revolution and beyond to get to where they are now, is basically squeezing developing countries like India. We basically now have another 50 years, and if you take, let's say, 91 as the turning point, so you had 50 plus 30, just 80 years to achieve what the developed world has achieved in 200, 300, 400 years.
Well, the track record that you said of climate finance is definitely a disappointing one. The good news is that this time there is immense pressure, that the spotlight is there on the developed countries, that if they don't make up for the shortfalls of past climate finance and start discussing a much higher climate finance target in the trillions rather than the billions, then a lot of people, a lot of countries will lose faith. And, we may have to look for other ways outside of this climate change process, which is really essential. Climate change is a global problem and you need a global process. So the success of this process is very much something at stake for all of us, including India. But I'd like to make an additional point of why India is doing all this. Why did we announce these very ambitious pledges yesterday? Mm-hmm. It is because for us, climate change is a risk, it's a threat, and it's an opportunity. Risk, because we are very vulnerable to impacts of climate change, to hazards. Yeah. Threat, because our industry has to be competitive with other countries, with Europe, which is introducing a carbon tax, with US, which is going in for electric vehicles in a big way. But it is also an opportunity for us to bring better health, more green jobs, more kinds of investments, not just through these climate finance flows, but also through commercial technology partnerships. Okay. And the important point is this need not be an overnight abrupt transition. It can be a planned gradual transition over the next few decades so that the cleaning of our electricity grid, as you would have seen from these targets, goes hand in hand with other measures in the transport sector, in the building sector, and in the industrial sector. Okay. So it's going to be really a whole of economy approach that is going to affect almost every aspect of the way we live.
It is going to fundamentally change the way we live, all aspects, the ones that Alka talked about, and also the way we think about these issues. I want to go back to Arnaba Ghosh. Let's talk a little bit about these near-term targets that you had mentioned. 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by the end of the decade, cutting down this billion emissions by the end of the decade, and of course, taking India's share consumption of energy to over 50% for green energy. Again, it comes back to, do we have the logistics for it? Do we have the framework for it? And are these achievable, or are these too ambitious for us to achieve over the next 9 years?
I think what India has demonstrated is that we can actually ramp up capacity for renewables very quickly if we put our policy, finance, and technology behind it. 11 years ago, India had less than 20 megawatts of solar. Today, we have more than 100,000 megawatts of solar and wind and biomass and so forth. That does not mean it's going to be easy. Between now and 2030, every waking hour, or rather every working hour, 6 days a week, 365 days a year for the next 9 years, we would have to deploy about 10.5 megawatts of renewable energy capacity. That's a breathless marathon that India has to run, but that's the commitment it has made for the planet. Now, to back up that commitment, India now expects that investment in large quantum is going to flow into its market. Okay. Because if the investment does not flow fast enough and at a rate of finance that is affordable enough, then the same capacity installations slow down, and not just our targets suffer, but the planet suffers as well.
Okay, so let me go back to Palash on that point. Do you expect investments to come in the space of renewable and clean energy at the pace at which Arunabha Ghosh is talking about? We need about 10 megawatts of power generation from clean energy sources for every hour for the next decade or so.
So it's like what Alka said. There is intense pressure on the international community, especially the developed world, to ramp up their not just meet their commitments, but to ramp up their contributions to this area. But I must add to this that there have been significant steps that have been taken, mostly at the level of the national government, to enable the framework and the regulatory framework to get private finance flowing as well. But alongside this, there needs to be a lot more reform at the state level, because we know our discoms are mostly cash strapped, and in order for this renewable energy to flow freely, there is significant room for improvement there.
Neha Pahuja, just in terms of, one of the things that the Prime Minister also talked about is sustainable consumption, and I think he was sort of holding a mirror out to the West. You're not going to get to net zero by 2050 or 60 or 70 unless the way consumption is imagined, particularly in the Western world, that is completely reimagined.
Yeah, absolutely, because going to net zero would mean that we limit our consumption of products so that we don't emit more in terms of producing that kind of product. So lifestyle and consumption patterns need to change. And so to say, I mean, given the situation in India, where we know most of the people are below poverty level, I mean, we still have huge development deficits, and we have huge development process to be undertaken in those areas.
Okay.
So, and there we can initiate the process of developing at a better, cleaner pace. So we don't have to lock in our infrastructure and lock in our emissions at the moment for that select population. So we have an opportunity because we have yet to develop. While the developed countries have developed and they have locked in their infrastructure in an energy-intensive, carbon-intensive assets. So they would have to find out a way. However,
okay.
I think the cleaner pathway, we are on the safe track. And at the moment, since we have 2030 plans and the long-term goal also, we, I think, have a clear vision in place, and we can go
all right, I'll give Alka Kilkar the last word. Just in terms of, has the conversation in India changed in the last 7 to 10 years? I mean, for the better part of, from, let's say, 92, the Kyoto Declaration, all the way till about the 2010s, the conversation was, we are a developing country, we need as much of fossil fuels and other non-renewable sources of energy that are cheap and easily available for us to keep going in that trajectory of 8 to 10% GDP every year. Has that conversation changed in India to the extent that where we're saying today that it's not just about the GDP, it's about how sustainable this is over the next 2, 3, 4 decades?
Definitely the conversation has changed as India has become a vibrant economy. Not only that, the stakes have become much more real as climate events have become more frequent, more intense. I'll tell you what gives me hope. Three things really. One is, technology prices fall far more dramatically and rapidly than we can predict. Also, there are long-term investors, not just short-term investors, pension funds, who are looking at the kinds of investments that we're talking about today, not investments in dirty fossil fuels, but in new technologies. The other reason I get hope is because several European countries over the last 2 decades have succeeded in growing their economies while cutting their emissions. And this is even after we take into account the fact that they consume goods that are produced in other countries and that they import them.
Correct.
Even with that, it is possible to decouple emissions growth and economic growth.
All right.
And finally, to me, it is a way of bringing sustainable development, as you said. What does that mean? It means very simple things. Like if there is a rural hospital in Jharkhand, during the COVID pandemic, instead of spending all their money on diesel gensets, they were able to install a solar power on their rooftop and run ventilators on it.
Okay, I got to wrap up. I'm completely out of time, but thank you so much for this fascinating conversation to all our guests. I'm getting a piece of breaking news as well, which I need to go to. The Jammu and Kashmir government now is terminating the services of Feroz Ahmed Lone. He was the Deputy Superintendent of Jails, as well as Javed Ahmed Shah, school principal, both of whom were actively working with terrorist outfits. They were appointed, we're given to understand, in the previous regime. Arunama is joining us with more details. So this is in continuation with a series of actions that have been taken against government servants who have used their position for terror activities?
Yes, when we broke the story last night about, terror factories being run from jails in Jammu and Kashmir, we did mention Feroz Ahmed Lone, and now the government has terminated. Earlier also, he was under suspension. There was an inquiry going on. Now they've terminated Feroz Ahmed Lone, who was the DSP of J&K Prisons Department, and also Javed Ahmed Shah, the principal officer there. What they have been accused of is conspiring with Riaz Naiku. He's one of the most important Hizbul terrorists who has been eliminated in recent times. As per government statement, investigation has revealed the two youth, namely Danish Gulam Lone of Brabandina, and this is of Littar of Pulwama, and Sohail Ahmed Bhatt of Avantipura, were recruited and asked by Naiku to meet Ishaq Pala. Again, this is the name that we broke yesterday about Ishaq Pala's role from running the terror factory from Jammu and Kashmir jails. So Ishaq Pala, Riaz Naiku, and these two government officials, Feroz Ahmed Lone and Javed Ahmed Shah, were all part of this conspiracy to send youth from Jammu and Kashmir across the line of control to Muzaffarabad and post-training get them back into Jammu and Kashmir. Now action has been taken.
All right, we'll leave it at that, Arunama. So it's an impact story here on CNN News 18. We had broken the story yesterday about how jails were being used to run terror networks. And this jailer, as well as the school principal, were actively involved in that, both of whom have now been terminated from their respective government service. That's a wrap. I'll catch you again at 9 o'clock with Brass Tacks.